In that same book you wrote, and I quote, that the USDA has the greatest potential of any institution for defining the vision of a sustainable agriculture.
Right.
And do you still believe that? Are you still hopeful? That
Well,
not the vision, the mission of a sustainable
I'm
agriculture.
hopeful, but I'm not optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it has to do with the scale. You know, that 20 years ago, Earth Day 1970,
Right.
What popped up after that was an extrapolation of population, an extrapolation of resources, resource depletion, an extrapolation of environmental pollution. And what followed from that was people developing scenarios of the future.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what we've learned, I think, by 1990 is that most of the ecological problems that are going to be faced us in the next 20 years are as unpredictable, say, as the breakup in Eastern Europe or as, say, AIDS was 15 years ago. In other words, the next 20 years is going to be one of surprises, and that extrapolations won't be the way to get at it.
And you're saying they're going to be both good and bad. Both
well, I
AIDS
don't
and
see many good surprises.
Uh-huh.
I think there are going to be ecological problems popping up that are, you know, maybe worse than the AIDS threat or whatever. All right. Well, what I'm getting at is, what does a people do in order to minimize the losses that are bound to come? Or what does a people do that is looking for solutions to problems? One thing, you keep your scale small. You don't look for the mega solution. You don't look for the one-shot big solution. And big bureaus like, well, policy. Policy tends to be geared toward the larger solution. Now, if the USDA can get serious and quit being so self-satisfied, if it can get serious and start thinking in terms of smaller scale approaches to dealing with the farmer on the land, and make it its mission to keep the people there that are there and to figure out ways to get more back on the land. What the land needs is what I've called a high eyes to acres ratio. Lots of people watching it. That either your landscape has a sufficiency of energy and capital, and if that's the case, there's going to be probably more erosion, or it has a sufficiency of people. And we are land animals, and we need to be living out our lives on the landscape. Not everybody, but there needs to be. I've estimated that the U.S. countryside could stand about 80 million people, and not desecrate it. In fact, sustain it. That is, we go at it like park rangers to sustain the American landscape, and then in turn it would sustain us. So what I would hope is that we could have policy that would help along that line. I've not seen a single Secretary of Agriculture that has really had that vision. And they are, of course, derivatives of the administration, and on and on and on. Rather, what I find is apologies for and tooting the horn for the establishment which features the extractive economy. And well, even the current Secretary of Agriculture, I don't see much coming out of. I don't see much coming out of him. He gave a speech to the USDA people in which he said something about 1/6 of an aspirin in a tanker car was like 1 part per billion. Well, how would he regard an AIDS virus in the human body, which would be about 1 part per billion, or a carcinogen that could cause a mutation in a cell? Little things mean a lot.
Yes.
Mutation in a cell that could lead to cancer. And so, anyway, we've got to get this, we've got to get and it's going to take a grassroots effort to develop a constituency that'll start putting the right people in office.
Well, that's
and that think small. See, I want to say one other thing. Descartes, in his Discourse on Method, said that the more he sought to inform himself, the more he realized how ignorant he was. Now, rather than regard that as an apt description of the human condition and a very proper result of a good education, Descartes thought it correctable. So what we have really is a knowledge-based culture. And in fact, the industrial mind is based on, whether it's Soviet, you know, whether it's communist or capitalist, the industrial mind assumes that our knowledge is adequate to live in the world. Well, what we don't know is billions of times greater than what we do know. In other words, ignorance overshadows knowledge by far. Descartes was wrong. All right, so if we assume we're ignorant, that we're stupid and wicked at the same both, that we're going to be ignorant, then what do you do as a way of coping with it? Again, keep your scale small. Be able to cut your losses. You don't build huge nuclear power plants. You don't build coal-fired plants that give you acid rain. You do something tentatively. You see how it's coming out, and you know, you don't run the risk of global warming or ozone holes or whatever. You go along and you look at anything you do as kind of a tentative experiment. You don't spread atrazine all over the Midwest and then wait for the poisonous effects and have to shut down the wells and then say, whoops. You get on top of it right away and keep your scale small. So we've got a philosophical problem in this country that our knowledge is adequate. In my town of Salina, Kansas, population 40,000, they're wanting to locate a lead smelter there. And I've drafted a letter to go to the Salina Journal, I don't know if I'll send it, in which I'm saying, look, let's not allow the lead smelter in, because what we know about lead is there's no safe level, but there are a lot of unknowns as well. And so I'm suggesting in the letter that we put a sign up on Interstate 70 that says, Salina, Kansas, population 40,000, a good place to live because we're ignorant and we know it. Now, you realize the Chamber of Commerce boys aren't going to like that very much.
I don't think they'll go for it.
They won't go for it, but, you know, in a certain sense, it'd be the beginning of wisdom.
Do you really feel that that small way of looking at things can be defended in light of how many people that we have to feed, and we're told all the time we have to be responsible for? Especially. It can be defended in light of how many people we have to feed. Look, we're used to aggregating numbers, and you can have food measured out in metric tons, but it doesn't say anything about the food, where it's produced, and whether and who's being fed that food. Look, global consciousness is an abstraction. And it's impossible, really impossible. Wendell said this in an essay. I think it was a speech that he gave, Wendell Berry, it was a speech that he gave at College of the Atlantic, that you can't work globally. Nobody can work globally. You can only work in particular. You can only work in your backyard or in a place. This notion, you can't think of the globe. Look, if you want a good overview, you don't fly at 33,000 feet. It doesn't tell you anything about what's going on down there. You see some kind of a landform, maybe a little bit. I shouldn't say anything. But this tendency to aggregate does not, which is what the big scale folk are crazy about, does not acknowledge that the world is uneven. And it's in its unevenness that the particulars become important. So I think part of our mission has got to be now in the next 10 to 20 years, our mission has got to get people away from this belief that large aggregation, that food is a solution to famine. You know, I think Francis Moore LePay has done us a great service in pointing out food is not a solution to famine. That if you are growing food for cash, then you're going to create some serious socio-cultural problems. I mean, how is it? I heard here, I haven't checked up on it myself, but I understand that Mexico, where corn had most of its origin, is now importing corn for tortillas. Now, what's going on here? You know, if that's the case, well, they're growing strawberries and broccoli and so on for America's tables, and what was the incentive? Cash, probably. Well, they ought to be feeding their people beans and rice, or beans and potatoes, or whatever mix is necessary to take care of that exploding population. And of course, then you still got to ask, then what? I mean, we got to bring population under control.
I was wondering if you were going to mention that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's just, we've got to start having more effective contraception and make it available, as well as contrasumption. You know, they're both important. And if we don't, we're just going to ravish the planet.